Imagine waking up one day to find that your neighbor, coworker, friend, or family member has just disappeared. Without a trial, without a say, just gone. Deported. Faster than they can even leave a message. Now, imagine this happened to someone who isn't even an illegal immigrant. It was someone who had the full right to be in this country. They were simply caught up in one of the flaws of our justice system. This problem seems so far away, doesn't it? But no, this isn't the problem for the future or for the past, and it isn't happening in a far-off land. It's happening now, and it's all around you. I'm Somi, and this is Legal Called Sanity, where I will explain the ins and outs of legal policies and ethics, stripping away the fancy terms that hide the truth, to show you exactly what's going on in your country. For today's episode, we will be diving into America's immigration policies and whether they are actually as good as they were intended to be. I will be dissecting recent cases on deportation and show you exactly what's going on. But before that, let's see the span of this deportation. Over the past few years, the meaning and impact of immigration policies have changed to fit the political agendas of deportation. Some of these changes are threatening asylum, which is a form of protection given to those who fled their own countries to escape persecution, where they quite literally fear being harmed because of their race, religion, or belief. Other changes are resurrecting policies from the 1700s, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. This policy was initially used to consolidate the power of one political party in the nation. Fun fact, that political party was the Federalists, who, by the way, lost all their power just a few years after that act. Lastly, some deportation regulations have so many potholes in them, and people who have every legal right to be in America fall through those potholes and are wrongfully deported, having their lives completely overturned. Each of these following scenarios depicts how people are getting caught in the crosshairs of these flawed policies and unforeseen nuances. First, we'll take a look at Las Americas v. DHS, a case challenging new government policies on asylum for persecuted victims. This case was centered on the Biden administration adding new restrictions on asylum during its interim final rule, IFR, in June of 2024. An IFR is a statement or set of rules and actions that the government can take without any consent from the public. The two major changes it brought were that once 1,500 people on average per day over 28 days crossed the border, others would be turned away. Imagine walking hours from your home in hopes of starting a new life, but then being turned away because the border quota was met. Even once you enter the country, this change allowed people seeking asylum to be removed with as little as 4 hours to contact an attorney. The only exception to this rule was when the returnee showed fear of return, which was not what the immigration law stated. Unaccompanied children are going to be included in this calculation. With these new rules, only one option was left for asylum seekers to come into America, at least from our southern border. That was the CBP-1, a mobile app where they could get appointments for asylum. Unfortunately, those appointments were far and few between. And in January 2025, once President Trump got inaugurated, he eliminated that option. Imagine you were an asylum seeker. How would you feel having the doors to America shut right in front of you? And remember, some of these people are being persecuted and quite literally fleeing from murderers. While fighting for the rights of those asylum seekers and responding to these turn of events, two nonprofit organizations, Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, sued the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, and several other government corporations involving immigration. After all, that's your legal system at work. The public can fight for their voice, even against the government. In this case, they sued on the basis that the new regulations set on asylum by the IFR were against the 701 Administrative Procedure Act, APA, and the Immigration and National Act, INA. Now, I know that sounds fancy and complicated, but in simple terms, it just means that they argued that the DHS didn't have the power to change immigration procedures on their own. That means that their changes were subject to review by the courts. The basic question in this case is whether the DHS can change these policies without an input from the courts or Congress. The APA Act defined the exceptions for judicial review. The DHS claimed that they were one of those exceptions, and they tried to hold back the floodgates that could be opened with a judicial review. The courts, however, did not go for that. Under the APA Act, the DHS can only skip a judicial review if another law explicitly says it can. But here's the key point. No law did. This was the turning point in the case, because keep this in mind, if the DHS proved that they were an exception to the review, the case would have ended right then and there. However, now that the case was deemed reviewable, the plaintiffs, Las Americas, brought up the INA Act, which defined the term aliens and explained the procedures that needed to be followed to apply for asylum. It also outlines the eligibility of asylum seekers and the rules involving removal. The DHS changed these rules by itself, which they weren't exactly allowed to do. The INA said that any non-citizen who came into the America could apply for asylum, but that was changed under the IFR, as it only allowed people who booked an appointment on the CBP-1 to apply. Simply put, the DHS tried to change asylum laws on their own, but the court said they couldn't. In other words, the DHS tried to rewrite asylum policies that already existed. Since the INA gave them mandatory rules to follow, they couldn't just overrule them, and definitely not without a judicial review. For our second case, we will be going over JGG v. Trump, where the deportations under the age-old Alien Enemies Act went far beyond modern rules and ethics. This case was started by 5 men who sued Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which is from 1798, on the deportation of Venezuelan immigrants. These men were in immigration custody and faced deportation. Similar to them, there were several million Venezuelans who came in through the border to escape the country's political and economic instability. The Alien Enemies Act was only used a total of 3 times in America's history. It was first initiated by the last influential Federalist president, John Adams. He used it to crush down foreign protests of public criticism. He used it to crush down foreign protests and criticism against him, and deport people if they were from a quote-unquote enemy country during the War of 1812. These acts were a part of the acts known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were widely condemned as an overstep of political power, and they were allowed to expire quickly once President Jefferson took office. But the Alien Enemies Act was not exactly repealed. In fact, the same act was brought up during World War I and II, and it has come to haunt us once again. Even ignoring its history of causing chaos, this act is a wartime law. President Trump enacted this law in response to the Tren de Aragua, a gang from Venezuela that was involved in extortion, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. He said, and I quote, "That's an invasion. It invaded our country. You know who you're shooting at. You know who you're going after." As a citizen of America, do you think we're at war? In the context of the Tren de Aragua gang, any non-citizen alleged to be members can be deported without being allowed to go to a judge or immigration officer to plead their case. Imagine someone just accused you of being part of this gang, and you just got deported without even having a chance to defend yourself. Sounds similar to a witch hunt, doesn't it? However, the problem here is that illegal immigration is not technically an invasion. Several legal experts say that this wartime law is not allowed to be applicable in this sense. The case raised against them was brought by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and the Democracy Forward. Similar to the 1800s, they argued that this law was unconstitutional, and they filed for a temporary restraining order, TRO, to stop the deportation of 5 Venezuelan detainees for 14 days. The court allowed this and issued a proclamation, allowing them a motion for class certification, which simply meant that people with similar cases could litigate together instead of having many separate cases. This meant that anyone in a similar situation would also be allowed to stay for 14 days under the same restraining order. The court also said that any plane of deportees that had taken off with people who were under the same proclamation should return immediately. This meant that anyone in a similar situation with similar cases should also be allowed to stay for 14 days under the same order. The court also said that any plane of deportees that had already taken off with people that could be included in this group should return immediately. However, the government continued to deport people to whom the proclamation actually applied to. That would make these deportations in violation of the Due Process Clause. I ask you this: what power does our judicial system even have if it doesn't prosecute everyone equally? If our government just takes a court order as a friendly suggestion that they can ignore if it doesn't match their needs, what happens to people then? Well, in this case, this is what the court did. After ignoring the TRO, the government tried to annul it, which the court denied. In fact, the TRO was extended to April 12th, and on the 16th of the same month, Judge Boasberg raised the issue of the defendant, which is the government in this case, not following their order. Even if the TRO had now ended, it didn't change the fact that the court order was knowingly ignored by the government. So the court told the defendants to do one of two things. Either they had to show that they were trying to fix their mistake, or they had to give names of those who wrongfully deported people protected under the court order, which essentially means they had to throw someone under the bus. However, the DC Circuit blocked this charge. In the same month, the plaintiffs extended their class action to include all non-citizens who were in custody and petitioned for a preliminary injunction, which is a judicial order to protect these people. Essentially, it's a permanent version of the TRO. In this case, while similar to TRO, it's just not temporary. It permanently protects the plaintiffs and prevents the defendants, the government, from taking harmful actions against them. This injunction stands until it is either removed or modified, unlike the previous TRO, which was just temporary. Judge Boasberg approved the injunction and ordered the defendants, the government, to restore the plaintiffs' habeas rights by June 11th. Habeas rights are just there to protect people from unlawful detention, and they include the rights for people to defend themselves in court, which the deportees did not initially get. A day before the due date to restore these rights, the government tried to get a stay on a preliminary injunction, which means to stop the order from going through. In the end, the judge also denied that. Ergo, habeas rights were restored. However, the legality of the deportations under the Alien Enemies Act was not ruled upon. The case only ruled upon the legality of the way the deportations were carried out, not in the actual deportation. Do you agree with this court ruling? These two cases are just a few examples of the current deportation crisis ravaging America. While some are clearly fighting back against unfair deportation policies, many people are slipping through the holes of fair legal proceedings and are being deported without fair process. In several cases, we have our own government standing up against our legal system in itself in a bizarre tug of war. Now, to see how this crisis will unfold, we must look towards what people will do. After all, our legal system was made so that laws can be changed through review. When people are more informed of the crisis going on in their own backyard, they will be able to decide for themselves whether or not to support or reject the laws upheld today. Some believe that deportation policies are completely just, that those who enter the country illegally should be deported as quickly as possible, because being here is unfair to all those who legally came into America. Without strict border control, floodgates of people would open, so many that America cannot support them all at once. Others, however, believe that laws, as malleable as they are, should follow a strict moral code, which means that everyone should have a right. Now, after hearing this, what do you believe is the state of American deportation policies today? Will you support the political agendas behind these laws, knowing what they entail? Or will you be one of those fighting against it? Courts can decide legalities, but it is people who decide what to argue as just or unjust in front of a judge. The legal system of this country can only protect those who understand and know how to use it, which is a skill that many Americans today lack, for better or for worse. That is why this podcast exists, to help anyone willing to gain that skill. For more information on what's happening in your own backyard, some podcast updates, and term lists for any legal term that I used, check out Legal Call to Sanity on Instagram, or check out my LinkedIn, which is also linked on the same page. And if you'd like to help further this podcast, please fill out the form linked in the description below, or also on the Instagram page. And be honest, it'll help me pick out your topics, and it'll help me choose topics that you guys actually want to know about. See you all next time on Legal Call to Sanity. In the meantime, don't go insane.